We're very fortunate and happy to have John with us. I'm a big fan of like this standing stones and modern Cornwall, but I'm really looking forward to finding out how Cornwall actually started. I just have a couple of paragraphs. One is from the introduction that you had in your email, and the other couple paragraphs are from, I believe, the back of his book, which I purchased today from Amazon. So I have John Fletcher has been an early medieval reenactor for 16 years, which much of that being focused on recreating life in the 8th through 11th century Cornwall and Devon. He has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Sciences and focused his dissertation on how climate change impacted early medieval settlement on Dortmore.
Okay, so let's just go in your office. I'm sorry.
Could you please put yourself on mute? We can hear you. So, and this is from the back of his book, I believe. It has quotation marks around it, but it didn't say exactly where it came from. In the 5th century, the Roman Empire collapsed and Western Europe began remaking itself in the turmoil that followed. In Southwest Britain, old tribal authorities and identities reasserted themselves, and a ruling elite led a vibrant and outward-looking kingdom with trade routes that stretched around the Atlantic coast of Europe and abroad to the Mediterranean. They and their descendants would forge their new kingdom into an identity and a culture that lasts into the modern age. The Western Kingdom, that's the name of the book, is the story of Cornwall and how its unique language, culture, and heritage survived even after politically merging with England in the 10th century. It's a tale of warfare, trade, and survival, and defiance in the face of defeat. So, John, take it away.
Oh, thank you very much for that. Yeah, the blurb on the back there was just written by myself when I was trying to kind of summarize what I wanted to write a book about, essentially. Just to not to weigh too much on sort of introductions and things, but when I moved to Plymouth, which is where I did my undergraduate, which is just on the border between Cornwall and Devon, I was already an early medieval reenactor, so I'm one of these people who dresses up like an early medieval person, a Viking, an Anglo-Saxon, etc. I had a vague idea that the Cornish weren't the same as the English, having come to England earlier in my childhood from America originally. And I started doing some research about that, and that spitballed and tumbled out for me into essentially this book. So yeah, what I'm going to go through today, I want to talk to you to start with about the Southwest itself generally, Southwest of Britain. I'm going to sort of give a very quick Cliff Notes introduction to what the early medieval period is, when I keep saying that, and then how in that period the Cornish identity, the idea of a Cornwall emerges, and then how it survives in the face of the story that most people know, which is the emergence of the Kingdom of Wessex eventually becoming the Kingdom of England, and then from there much of medieval European history being dominated by wars of the English kings against their neighbors, and here, there, and everywhere. And then yeah, at the end, great to hear any questions or concerns, or just yell at me. It's fine. Anything you guys fancy doing, always happy. I work in procurement in my day job, so used to exchanges quite a lot.
Very good. I need to interrupt you just for a second. I just wanted to remind the people that just came in that we are being recorded. Go for it, John.
That works. So what I like to start with when I'm talking to people about early medieval Cornwall and the early medieval world is actually start thinking about the way we view Britain in our minds. Because we talk a lot about history, we talk about figures, we talk about battles. We don't always go into what the people at the time thought of the locations or what those locations looked like to them. So this is just a map of the United Kingdom, except a bit of Scotland's been cut off. There are hundreds of these. This is showing the motorway network, but it shows my essential kind of point that for a modern point of view, if you ask people in the UK or elsewhere, they'll have this sort of idea where all roads lead to London, and then the crossing point between Dover and Calais is essentially the link between the UK and the rest of Europe. However, is that the way people in the past saw the UK or Britain, as the older name would be? And the reality is it's not really, because it couldn't be. What I've just flicked across next to it is a hydrological map. So these are rivers. This is, again, a modern map. So this is actually without the Somerset levels, which would be dominating the area essentially northeast of Exeter. And it's missing a few others where they've been not included because it's about access rights, things like that. What you can see, though, is that areas like the southwest, like Wales, like the northwest, are covered in these kind of crisscrossing waterways and things like that, which would make overland travel the kind of road network we rely on now. Like you can see the M5, which is the main motorway into the southwest, is bisected by a number of rivers along its route, would have made traveling in a time before modern highways, before drainage projects, before everything else, extremely difficult. So for many people in sort of pre-Roman even Britain, there was going overland wasn't your first priority. It wasn't the first thing you think to do because it would be a long, dangerous journey. You're talking about crossing potentially Bodmin Moor, Dartmoor, Exmoor, across the Somerset levels just to sort of move. But what you do have is access to the sea. You are surrounded by sea on all sides if you're living in the southwest of Britain. And what that means is you're linked to other people who live on the coastal regions of the Atlantic coast of Europe. So Ireland, Wales, Armorica, which is what becomes Brittany later on. And we can see evidence of this kind of linkage via the sea really, really early on. So this is stone. It's actually a high definition photograph of a stone at Boscawen in Cornwall. You can see at the bottom there are 2 feet essentially carved. You can see well, but they are there. There are 2 circles in about the midpoint of the stone. And these are symbols you quite commonly find on stones in Brittany, in Armorica. This is a stone from, I will have to pull my notes out because it's the only thing we're presenting mode. But essentially from one of the stone circles of Brittany. It was actually destroyed in World War II. This is a photo from 1927 before the stone was destroyed. And again, you get that same symbolism of the feet. Elsewhere on stone circles of Brittany, you get that same circle symbol we've seen here, and you find it on 1 or 2 in Ireland as well. So these commonality of symbols that are following a marine network. And this is the Neolithic period. So you're talking in the range of about 3,000 years BC or BCE, depending on your preferred usage. So how did people at the time see themselves, and how did other people see Britain, really? It's very difficult to answer that question because essentially we're not there. We're sort of guessing. We can get hints to it though. What this image here is actually a map from the 11th century, so from the 1000s, but it's based on a much earlier Roman and potentially Greek map, as most of these are at the very beginning. This is a map of Britain. It might not look very much like Britain because obviously this is a very early interpretation of it. But the thing you immediately start to see is that the Southwest is sort of dramatically overemphasized. It's much larger on these maps, and this is consistent across a number of the very early maps compared to its actual size and prominence in Britain. The reason for that probably is that for the people who are making these maps, and those would be Greeks, those would be Romans, it was the bit they were the most familiar with or the bit they were interested in. So it got the first prominence. We get hints of this with people writing at the time. Greek writers around 2000 BC are saying things like, oh, if you go up to the Cassaridides, which is the Tin Isles, you'll meet people who are more civilized than the general barbarian populations. And what they mean is they're more Greek. They will speak Greek to you. They will give you wine. They will, trade with you the tin, which is obviously very, very vital for the Bronze Age economy. So again, this isn't somewhere that's just isolated. It's not on the tip or the edge of Britain and miles away from the southeast or the heartlands, whatever else we would think about it today. This is very intimately linked into an international trading community and is active in that trade to all the way into the Mediterranean and beyond that into the wider world. Just off the coast of Israel, they found a shipwreck with tin ingots, which they tested and proved originate in Cornwall. So again, this is something that's left a very firm archaeological record to back this up. The next image here, this is a lead anchor stock, which was pulled out of Plymouth Sound. It doesn't look very much, I will grant you, it just looks like a bar of lead because essentially it is a bar of lead. However, the dating and the design of it proves that this is from a Roman vessel from around 500 BC. So again, this is very, very early evidence that this is linked in via the sea, because they are looking out at it on all these three sides. So when we then start to sort of push a little later, when we'll circle back to this point, we start to see things in a slightly different light. For example, why are there Briton-speaking settlements in the early medieval period, well, Britannic-speaking, I should say, in Amorica, what becomes Brittany, in Galicia, in the north of Spain? Are they running from the Anglo-Saxons? Because that's the traditional story. The traditional story is the Anglo-Saxons arrive and people immediately flee. But that doesn't make a huge amount of sense. And again, we'll circle back and talk about this a bit more later on. Is there another reason linked to what we may know when we flip our understanding of how they saw the world? Well, one very sort of interesting piece that we can look at is a geological map. So what you've got here are the bits in red are known tin deposits in Europe, particularly ones that are exploded during the Bronze Age. So if you overlay that map, obviously the southwest of Britain with the granite batholith, which is why Cornwall and Devon has so much tin. You've got northwestern France, Brittany, again, very involved in this tin trade from very early on. And the sort of spine of Spain, including the northern part of Spain, Galicia. They weren't just fleeing away from somebody, they weren't running away. They were making an attempt to establish or re-establish trading links and a trading network that they had been using for thousands of years. So before I sort of jump into this next point, why is that important? Because if we rethink about the Southwest and the people living in the Southwest, not as essentially agents that add to the story of Wessex or add to the story of England, these are people who are civilized, who are in a very sort of valuable commodity trading network. So tin is hugely valuable throughout history. The Bronze Age obviously has very martial aspects because you need bronze weapons, bronze armor. Even after that, you're talking about bronze decorations, beautiful jewelry. Church bells start to become a thing in the early medieval period. So the church, even though it's not quite the Catholic Church yet, is suddenly this massive customer and consumer of tin. All this is adding huge value, and they know what's going on in the world. They're not isolated. They're not these sort of woad-painted savages on the edge of nowhere. And when we understand that, we can then, when we talk about what we're going to have to look at with Wessex and their expansion, how that is, it's not just the inevitability of Wessex, the inevitability of the English sort of state, which is essentially the narrative that the Victorians, who form a lot of our early understanding of this period, wrote. It's actually a clash between two different people and an accommodation that has to come out of that, which is how it survives into the sort of the modern day. So yeah, the starting point, it's not the edge of England where nothing is, it's the center of a very vital trading network. So what is the early medieval period? The early medieval period, very, very broadly, is the period between around 450 AD to 1066. Again, this is a very British-centric way of looking at the world, but it is the period from which the Roman legions are said to officially be gone from Britain, and the Normans invade in 1066 and flip it from an Anglo-Saxon to a French continental mixed nobility sort of thing. We tend to think of this period as a very grim, sort of very dark period. It was quite literally called the Dark Ages. It's still frequently called the Dark Ages, although academics tend to move away from that now. A lot of that's to do with, again, stories that people want to tell. As I mentioned, a lot of our understanding of this period starts in the Victorian era, where Victorian historians start to write down a national story of Britain, of England, sort of thing. And they lean quite heavily on the sources they've got. One of whom is Gildas, who's a monk living in the 6th century. So after the events that he's writing about, by, again, probably about 200 years, and he's not actually a historian. This is one of the interesting things about him. He's often brought up as this kind of historian. He's writing a history. What he's actually doing is writing a sermon about how terrible all the British kings are and how they're evil and wicked and fallen to sin, and shouldn't they all be punished. I've copied and pasted my favorite quote of his, which I'll just sort of read for you. The subject of my complaint is the general destruction of everything that is good and the general growth of evil throughout the land, but that I rejoice to see her revive therefrom, for it is my present purpose to relate the deeds of an indolent and slothful race. Now, if your chosen news network opened with that headline, I don't think anybody would really be taking it seriously, whatever their next thing was going to say. This is very much not a dispassionate accounting of events. This is a man with a mission he believes from God, to tell people how terrible they are. And he never claims for a minute that that isn't what he's doing. It's literally a sermon he is giving to his congregation. The events that happen in this period are very, very important for particularly British history, but all through European history, really. This is the crucible of nations, essentially. You enter the early medieval period in the 450s with no England, there's no Wales, there's no Scotland. There are kingdoms, there are different regions, not all of whom align to their what we would consider geographic areas today. When you leave the period in 1066, there is a kingdom of Alba, a kingdom of Scotland, a kingdom of England. There is an idea, there isn't a kingdom of Wales because Welsh inheritance laws are very tricky, and that's one of the reasons it leaves the princes. However, there's an idea of Cymru, of the folk, as a singular unifying identity, which was not present before that. This is where a lot of modern British and European political states are essentially given birth, and that includes Cornwall and the Cornish. Just last thing to touch on before I move on to sort of talk about the next part is on the left-hand side here, this rather fabulous image of the soldiers fighting one another is from the Virgilius Romanus, which is, as the name sort of implies, a copy of Virgil, currently in the Vatican Library. And that is believed to be produced in southwest Britain in the early medieval period, probably around the 5th to 6th century. So again, you're looking at people who are capable of making these very Romanesque, very high art sort of works. It's not just that the Romans leave and all civilization crumbles into nothingness. You know, there are still people here who speak Latin, who teach each other in Latin. They are trading, they are doing all this stuff. We have to separate a little bit what we think of as the dark ages of the early medieval period from what people at the time were actually living through, and maybe ask questions about why the Victorians had a stake in suggesting that a powerful Germanic race coming and teaching a slothful people to be better was a good story to be pushing. So where do the Cornish sort of fit into this? Well, Gildas mentions the region. Of this so execrable a wickedness, Constantine, the tyrannical whelp of the unclean lioness of Damnonia, is not ignorant. Which is a great line. Unfortunately, we have absolutely nothing else about Constantine's mother, but I would love to know what she did to Gildas quite so much. Damonia is really interesting because it shares a tribal name with the Damonii, who were the tribal group the Romans encountered when they came over in sort of the 1st century AD and conquered England, essentially. For a long time, people said, oh, the Romans didn't come down to Cornwall, they didn't come down to the southwest, they left it alone, which essentially is just not true. It was never a particularly compelling argument. More and more as, particularly the last few years where there's been more construction works, we found Roman roads, we found Roman forts in Calstock, in areas like that. There's a lot of Roman infrastructure here. What there isn't is Roman cultural buildings. So there's not villas, there's not the grand estates. Excuse me. And a lot of that comes down to the way the Daemonians essentially joined the empire. The Durotriges, who are, as on that map, their neighbors to the east, resist the Roman invasion very manfully. They fight them tooth and nail and get absolutely slaughtered. There are lots of Roman accounts about this, about breaking Maiden Castle, the giant hill fort. Goes terribly for them. All evidence that we have, which is very little because basically the Romans don't write very much down about coming this way, is that what probably happened is the Daemonii saw this coming, were already used to trading with the Mediterranean, with the Romans in all likelihood. And rather than stand heroically and get slaughtered, they made a deal. They agreed to mine the tin, have it taxed, have it sent to Exeter, Isca Domnorum, which is the city the Romans built, and then onwards to be taxed and shipped through the Roman road network. In return, they seem to remain culturally somewhat unchanged. As I say, there's not the villas, there's not these grand works. There are a lot of luxury goods. There's a lot of wine. There's a lot of sort of jewelry, bits and pieces like that. But there just isn't the big sort of change of rural life that you see in, for example, the southeast or the north of England. So when the Romans leave, as we say, Daemonia, as we can see from Gildas, so again, he's writing in sort of the 6th century, about 100 years after the Romans have left, it seems to reassert itself fairly quickly, that the idea that you can still have an identifiable name based on this same region is really interesting. We know that they keep in contact with the Roman world. What we've got here are pottery sherds and slate toppers from Tintagel. So you can see where these would form into a Roman amphora. We know the amphora were made in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, so essentially in the Byzantine Empire, the remnants of the Roman Empire that persisted into the age of the Crusades. They are still shipping these goods to the southwest of Britain. You can see that they essentially cluster very tightly into the southwest and west of Britain in terms of finds. Again, there's a little bit on the southern coast of Ireland, which you would expect with, as I say, a trading network that is so tightly linked. The slate stoppers are really interesting as well, because this is suggesting that the people in the southwest of Britain aren't just using Roman luxury goods, they are reusing the amphora for their own purposes. Either they are making their own wine, mead, whatever it is. They are making an effort to maintain an image of Romanatus, of being still Romans, or the official inheritors of Rome in Britain, as you might say, rather than just you seeing these as disposable goods, as kind of once the wine is gone, it gets chucked away or anything like that. You can see that they're still linked into a very European wide network, and you can see that through a couple of objects. I've just picked one here. This is a brooch. This is from the sort of 5th, 6th century. It's very interesting. I mean, it's a very nice piece of bronze work anyway. This is actually bronze. But it's interesting because the animal on there, the sort of backbiting beast, is something you see a lot in what are called quat-style brooches, which are an Anglo-Saxon form of artwork. Very distinctive. It very much looks like one of these, except a quote-style brooch is essentially a circular brooch. Sorry, my pronunciation brooch will just go all over the place because I say the word about 1,000 times a day to myself, so apologies for that. With rings of these animals, very, very, very small. So you're talking about millimeters or, you know, 1/8 of inches sort of size. Where you get big animal brooches like this is actually in the Frankish world. So that would be the Germanic tribes that invaded what we now refer to as France, the Franks. They have these kind of big Romanesque brooches of animals, of, you know, salmon or horses or whatever else. So what you have here is somebody who's intimately familiar with two very different styles of art and has combined them together into a single object, meaning either the artist or the person who commissions it is, as I say, linked into that both of those worlds. He knows the Anglo-Saxons, he maybe traded with them, he knows the Franks, he knows what their sort of art's doing. And you can see this is a reproduction by a guy called Danegeld Historical Jewelry, just how, you know, striking this must have been when it was first made. And it's making a statement. It's making this statement of, you know, I am metropolitan, I am linked into it, you know, I know your fashions, come and trade, you know, come and let's do business, essentially. So when the Anglo-Saxons, as I'll refer them to, there's some debate about whether we should still call them that or whether we should change it, first arrive in Britain, given all that we've kind of discussed about a focus on trade, a sort of outward-looking kingdom, it's very likely that actually very little changes for Daemonia. They're not that bothered about what's happening in the south and east of England. It's, you know, the Romans are gone. There's no reason to send goods that way. The road network, particularly over the Somerset levels, falls into disrepair from what we can see fairly quickly. Again, for all those reasons we discussed, that it's actually quite a difficult landscape to move through. But eventually, Wessex, which is one of the kingdoms of what's called the Heptarchy of the Anglo-Saxons, does start to come south and west. They split the Britons of Wales from the Britons of the southwest by winning the Battle of Durham in the 500s. They continue pushing west essentially every time they are put under pressure by other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. They try and push further in and further in. From what we can pick up in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is obviously written by the Anglo-Saxons, hence the name, they are mostly fighting smaller polities, so these kind of post-Roman groups that maybe sprung up in areas that we're not familiar with. So there's like a king of Bath, for example, the city of Bath, a king of Gloucester, the city of Gloucester. There are these very smaller groupings that are kind of anchored around post-Roman cities or strongholds. Eventually, though, by about the 700s or the late 600s, the borders of Wessex come right to the borders of Daemonia, which is essentially the River Parrett, which nowadays is not the border between Devon and Somerset, but is very much in that kind of borderlands area. It seems like things might go back and forth a little bit. The initial hint we have that not everything goes the Anglo-Saxons' way is an entry where a king, Cerdic, who's very good at sort of pushing this westward attack, wins a battle, we're told, again, this is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, except his brother dies, and he immediately returns to his own kingdom and is kicked out of being king very rapidly after this. And the brother who dies' son becomes king. So they don't say they lost the battle, but if that was your victory, it's not exactly something you'd write home about, given all those factors. That suggests maybe they're hitting some form of stronger resistance, which potentially is the Daemonians now facing them. By the late 600s, they've won a couple of battles from what we can tell, but the border still is Fletcher and the Parrett. Around this time, we get another hint that the Daemonians are still a kind of unified people, because a Anglo-Saxon bishop called Aldhelm writes to King Geraint, and he calls him Lord of the Western Kingdom, which is where the title of my book comes from. So it suggests that there's nothing beyond him, essentially, like he is the king. Geraint is probably the best recorded of the kings of Daemonia or the kings of Cornwall that we have, because he is in this letter that survives from Aldhelm, essentially saying that the priests, the Southwest priests, are doing it wrong. They're calculating Easter in the Irish fashion, or what was the Irish fashion, and they're cutting their hair similarly in that sort of fashion, rather than the way that Rome has prescribed. It can seem quite strange to us these days, but the calculation of Easter was like the central question for the early medieval church. You had synods about it throughout the sort of 600s. Strange enough, the Irish actually give up their calculation of Easter before Daemonia and Cornwall does. And there are hints that the Cornish are still doing some things different to the rest of the church, even beyond this date. So this really is the holdouts of this method of sort of what's sometimes called Celtic Christianity. He's also in a poem, an elegy, which gives you a little bit of a hint about what's going to happen to him, unfortunately, which is called Geraint ab Urban, or Elegy for Geraint. And I've just sort of put up a few of the lines, stanzas there. As you can see, in Longbourth, I saw the rage of slaughter and biers beyond our number, and red-stained men from the assault of Geraint. In Longbourth, I saw the edges of blades in contact, men in terror and blood on the pate, before Geraint, the great son of his father. And in Longbourth, Geraint was slain, a brave man from the region of Divnant, which is the Welsh word for Devon. And before they were overpowered, they committed slaughter. So, like much Welsh heroic poetry, it ends on a major bummer. That is something of a feature of the early medieval period, unfortunately. But it's, again, really interesting because it gives us a very firm idea that this is the southwestern Geraint we're talking about. There are occasionally attempts to recast this into the north of England or somewhere else. It also suggests a location. So Longbourth is essentially Longport, so a place to dock ships. And right in the center, essentially, of the map, as you're looking at it, in the space between the green and the yellow, is a town called Langport in Somerset. Langport is fairly unremarkable these days, other than its name, which again is a pretty accepted mutation of this over the roughly 1,000 years between then and now. Very soon after this, sort of the loss at Longbourth, which is also in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, King In of Wessex, who's the king on their side, builds Taunton, which is the city, modern day town that sits right in the middle of the gap between Somerset Levels, which we talked about earlier, and the Quantocks, and the Blackdown Hills, which are these sort of range of foothills. So it's very clear that this is kind of the gateway into Devon, essentially into the southwest. At that moment is suddenly thrown open, and he then is trying to fortify the way behind him. So over the next 100 years or so, the map goes essentially from that to that. So by around the mid 700s, Exeter is known as Exencester, which is obviously the Old English, which eventually will become Exeter. It's no longer referred to as Isca Donorum. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle kind of talks about hard battles, about this kind of back and forth and things like that, but they do seem to be making slow progress. If it continues, it seems likely that Damonia or Cernu is probably going to start going the way that the Durotriges, that other Brittonic peoples have gone, of whom we have almost no record in the post-Roman world. They became part of Anglo-Saxon English polities and essentially vanished. I mentioned Cernu there. That's because after Geraint dies, after the Battle of Longbourth, mentions Damonia essentially cease. We don't hear about it anymore from sort of any sources. But what we do get for the first time is a mention of the Cornish. So this is the Latin and then the English translation from the Welsh annals. This is obviously a Brittonic record rather than the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. And it talks about the Battle of Hechil among the Cornish, the Battle of Garthmaelog, the Battle of Pencon, and the Britons were the victors in these three battles. So that phrase, among the Cornish, that's the first time Cornish is used as a descriptor of a people rather than a geographic idea. So Altem, who I mentioned earlier, he writes about Cornwall as a place, as a sort of subdivision within Damonia. So he talks about dire Damonia and dreadful Cornwall. He was not a fan, I'm afraid, after he had wandered through. But it had never been used as this kind of identifier for an actual people. You'll occasionally hear people talk about the Cornovii, and is that the Cornish? Is that the original thing? It's very difficult to say because obviously the corn, as I'm sure you're probably aware, in Cornwall comes from the Latin for horn, just a peninsula. So the Cornovii can be anyone who lives in a peninsula, essentially, or lives in a spit of land. And there are a few hints that some of those references that do exist probably mean other people in Wales or Northern England or things like that. But this is very clear. This is a clear cut. The Cornish are here. They're still a people, and they're standing their ground. And to a certain extent, that makes sense because one of the things that we can see in the archaeological record in the post-Roman period, in the Early period, is that in Cornwall, there's a lot of works going on. Tintagel is being expanded. It's being made stronger. There are new terraces being cut in the granite. Very hard, very difficult work with lots of money behind it. The Looe Peninsula is actually cut off by an earthwork called the Giant's Hedge. So again, you can imagine the amount of man hours required to make this enormous, essentially earth rampart, to make a secondary defensive location. There are obviously the tin mines are all working over, whereas in Devon, in Western Devon, you have a few bits and pieces, and obviously you have Exeter, you have Isca Donorum. But it almost appears that the loss of that kind of Roman trading network left the people in sort of the eastern half of Damonia, who were presumably at one point the rulers of traditionally the kings, without as much of a power base as the people who lived in the west of the country. And so when the king was removed, when Geraint dies heroically, immediately you see this kind of shift away from a Damonian identity to a Cornish one. What happens after that is the narrative changes for the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. They stop winning as many battles. There is literally the terms hard battles against the Welsh come in. A king called Cornwall strove constantly against the Welsh and the Irish and the Scots, so he's basically fighting constantly. Eventually, a king called Ecbert becomes king of Wessex, Ecgbert is not very well remembered by people who aren't, obsessed with the early medieval period like I am today, but he was very, very good at killing people. He is the king who takes Wessex essentially from a minor player constantly on the run from the other Saxon polities to really setting the groundwork for Alfred the Great and the other kings to make it the basis of a new English state. He fights a number of battles with the Cornish. Not all of them he potentially wins, or not all of them are won. So there's a battle at Gaffelford in 815, where essentially the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle just records a battle between the Cornish and the men of Devon. So again, this is the first time the men of Devon are given an English name separately. We don't get a victor. Some later sources will add a victor in, and it's always the English, but there's nothing there. What we do have is a charter of Ecgbert. So Ecgbert's preparing to face his big rival, Mercia, who's the other big Anglo-Saxon kingdom. He's getting ready to face them at the same year. And we have a charter of him saying that he's in Crediton in Devon amongst the army, as it says, at this time. And Crediton is a very long way away from Mercia and from the battle he wants to be fighting, which suggests that potentially the men of Devon lost their battle. And Ecgbert had to backpedal his forces to face a new threat, to stop the Cornish coming back and reclaiming land they lost in Western Devon. Excuse me. After that, very excitingly, the Vikings come onto the scene. I like Vikings, sorry, but lots of people get a lot of interest in this period from sort of Vikings, from the modern retellings. Usually they arrive in this kind of spate of fire and blood and raids. In Cornwall, it's very different. There's a couple of reasons for this, probably. One is that they most likely came from the north coast, from Ireland, because they are Hiberno-Norse, which means, for those of you who are familiar with the Cornish countryside, the north coast is beautiful, absolutely stunning, because you get lovely panoramic shots of cliffs and beaches beneath the cliffs and things, which are great for us, or for holidays, or for taking a selfie. If you have to land a boat of armed men at the bottom of the cliff and then walk up the tiny little path up the cliff to fight the people who probably saw you arrive, I imagine it's much less inviting. Vikings, first and foremost, are opportunists. They want to attack weak targets quickly, so it would not be their favorite terrain. Instead, they seem to work with the Cornish. In 836 or 838, dating in early medieval documents is weird. They join with the Cornish and invade Devon, fighting King Ecgbert at a place called Hingston Down. Lots of places will tell you that's near Callington in Cornwall, but the source that we have on it, which is again the Anglo-Saxons, you would expect to minimize any kind of risk to their narrative, write it down as they join together and take the fight to Ecgbert. So they invade his territory. They don't sit in Cornwall waiting for him to come to them. There are, in fact, actually, there are 4 potential sites it could be. There's a Hingston Down in Gunners Lake in Cornwall. There's a Hingston Down at Moulton Hampstead in Devon. There's another one near the Devon and Somerset border, and there is another one near Plymouth, which is actually a standing stone, which is sometimes referred to as the Hingston Stones. So it's just a very common name in this period, unfortunately. It just means essentially Horse Hill, Hengist Dun. So we can't say for sure where exactly it was. After that, fighting seems to stop, but obviously the Vikings are still a major pressing threat for England. And where that's really interesting for us is that you start to see Viking artifacts crop up in Cornwall more and more. So there are Viking works of stone, sort of Norse-inspired designs and stonework. There's jewelry, there are swords, there are pieces. You also see things like this. So this map here is the burhs, which Alfred the Great built. For those who are unfamiliar, Alfred the Great is the only English monarch called the Great because he essentially saved the English from being overrun by the Vikings. And he did it partially by building these fortified towns called burhs. But what you'll notice is that they stop in Devon. They don't even stop at the Tamar, which would be the modern Devon. They stop in Lidford, which is a town a little bit outside of, a little bit outside of where Tavistock is today. It's also arranged in this kind of almost spearhead formation where he's got one burh at the top, one burh at the bottom, and one burh in the middle. It's, when you compare it to the rest of the sort of borders of Wessex, where they're all built close together to support each other, it very much feels like a place he doesn't believe he has a very firm grip on. And the fact that he sticks one in the middle of the land, nowhere near any sort of sea or coast, suggests that he's not just looking at the sea as a potential threat. He's looking at across the Tamar to Cornwall. And that's really interesting because a lot of people will generally tell you that after 838, after Hingston Down, after the fighting ends, Cornwall becomes part of England. It just is instantly part of England. English kings control all the rest of it. But we don't have any evidence to support that. Things like this, actually, the evidence we do have suggests exactly the opposite, that they don't have any significant control of Cornwall in this period. So, as I say, Vikings, boats full of rambunctious Scandinavians arriving. And the evidence that we have for them are things like this. This is the Trewhiddle hoard. So this is a hoard of silver objects which was pulled out of a tin mine in the 1800s, 1700s possibly, actually. So forgive me if I've gotten that wrong. It's very eclectic. It's one of the things. So again, the instant story that's been applied to it for many years is that it was hidden from the Vikings. But when you then look at the objects, so we have this silver chalice, which is Irish work, very, very fine. You have this silver scourge, which is the thing at the bottom. It's called the scourge because we don't actually know what it is. Using braided silver wire to hit yourself with is probably a bit of a bad idea because if you are trying to whip yourself, it's not going to whip. If you do draw blood, it's going to tarnish the silver, so it seems a bit of an odd choice in the first place. So this is what archaeologists sometimes call ritual practices. So when they don't know what something is, they just sort of call it the closest thing and move on. We also have coins from Mercia and from Wessex, so from the two kingdoms that are still up and kicking against the Vikings. And we have a collection of what are called Trewhiddle style, because this is the Trewhiddle hoard, decorative objects. The really interesting thing about the objects is that other than the hoard, you don't find them in Cornwall in any of the other early medieval burials or sites we found. You find them in Mercia, you find them in Wessex, in the Midlands or East Anglia in England, but you don't find them where they were, other than the hoard, in Cornwall. So they were brought there from somewhere else. So when you put all that together, all the varying locations for the items, this actually suggests that this was a Viking's treasure, which he believed Cornwall was a safe place to hide it and then come back for later. The date of the hoard, the date of the coins, puts it right around the sort of Battle of Edington, which is when Alfred is going to go out there and decisively defeat the Vikings. So it may be that the Viking who buried this treasure died in that battle, and that's why he never came back. But it's very interesting, and it showcases this kind of unexpected influx of Scandinavian support into Cornwall, even during the period where supposedly they are under, English control. And that's really important because this lack of control, this lack of consolidation from the period of Ecgbert through Alfred's reign and into his son's reign means that there's still this open question of, are the Cornish under kings to Wessex? Are they loyal to Wessex? Are they, something else? And it seems to be something that no one can really get a handle on. This is Edward, Alfred's son. This is a much later illustration, but I always like it because he looks very stern with his finger pointing out like that. He founds a bishop at Crediton, which again is in Devon. It's a bit of an odd choice. His dad put the bishopric at Exeter and put his biographer there, and he did tell him he had control of the Cornish church, but again, we don't see a lot of actual interaction with the Cornish church. Edward issues this charter and gives 3 towns in Cornwall, or 3 churches essentially, to his new bishop at Crediton, so that he will visit them every year and express their errors, for previously they resisted the truth as far as they could and did not obey the apostolic decrees. So again, he's suggesting that the Cornish are still doing things their own way, not listening to the bishops that Wessex has appointed for them, potentially having their own bishop, all of which kind of combines when the king is so tightly wound to the church in this period that they are not nice, compliant understates to Wessex. There is still a level of independence, a level of friction between the two, which he is essentially attempting to get rid of by force. It doesn't work, as far as we can tell. Doesn't seem to have any great success. Eventually, his son, Athelstan, is the one who sets a border. he sets the border at the Tamar, and that's really interesting thing that we'll circle back around to. There's a lot of stories about Athelstan. Athelstan is one of the only men before the sort of later medieval period who can claim to be king of all of Britain. So he is not just king of England, he is king of Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, other places all at once. And the way he does that isn't by conquering and sword and flame. He does a bit of that. He is good at getting an army and killing people when he needs to, but he's also much more willing to work with people to build coalitions, to build common ground, to let kings retain a measure of power under him as the overking. So when we hear famous stories like the cleansing of Exeter, which sort of is, oh, he came and he burned all the Cornish and cleansed the city of that filthy race, it's just nonsense. The writer in that case, which I believe is William Malmesbury, but it might be Geoffrey, so apologies if that was wrong. He went, we believe, to Exeter in the 1300s. No reason to doubt him on that particular part, and just asked for stories about Athelstan, because Athelstan founded the monastery where he was writing at. And essentially, he managed to find somebody in Devon who wasn't terribly fond of the Cornish, which I can assure you is not a difficult ask at most times. Equally, if you go to Cornwall and ask for opinions about Devon folk, you're going to get a lot of negative opinions. It's just one of those friendly rivalries that the English love. So he does set the Tamar. He does set the border at the Tamar, though. The other thing he does is reinstates a bishop at St. Germain's in Cornwall. So he actually says the opposite to what his father said. His father said, you will have my bishop and you'll follow the way that we're doing things. He says, no, it's fine. You can have your bishop. He'll be the official bishop, which comes with all these state powers as well as religious powers. But I'm the overking. You do essentially what I say, and I'll leave you to have your holdings and your lands, all the rest of it. And as I say, he establishes the border of the Tamar. So the Tamar is actually, although it's not counted as this because obviously Cornwall is not its own country, it's one of the longest, if not the longest, continuous border in Europe. The next closest contender is Andorra with Spain and France, which I think is the 1200s. But yeah, this is the 900s. This is 300 odd years before that. This border is set and has not moved. They occasionally try to shift things so that one bit goes to this bit or another, but it's been stubbornly resisted at every turn. So it is still the border between Devon and Cornwall to this day. The way that Athelstan works then is really interesting. He eventually brings all the kings of Britain who aren't pledged to him together at a place called Airmont Bridge and gets them to swear fealty. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that Howell of the West Welsh is among them who swears fealty. There's a possibility this is Hywel Dda, who's a very important Welsh national figure. However, I suggest that it's not for two reasons. One is that West Welsh is almost always used to mean the Cornish or Demonia in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Secondly, is that Hywel is very important in his time. He's been witnessing charters of Athelstan's for several years before Airmont Bridge, as is his cousin Idwal of Gwynedd. Gwynedd is the big Welsh power, and for the Anglo-Saxons, it is, you know, the goal to disrupt them and see them conquered. So the fact that Idwal isn't mentioned would be very odd if Hywel Dda was, because you'd essentially have one half but not the other of Wales. Whereas both of them had been witnessing charters, we don't see anything like that from Cornwall. So there's every chance that actually that is, again, evidence of a Cornish king going to pledge his fealty to Athelstan. Regardless of the specifics, from this point on, we do see more and more integration of Cornish elites into the English state. And I say integration, not conquest. What we've got here is a book from the Bodmin Manumissions. His actually official title is the Gospel Book of St. Petroc, because it is the Gospel Book from the Church of St. Petroc. This is a basically very intense scan that the British Library did of it, which you can see makes a lot more of the writing visible. And among the entries that we found is this entry. So the manumissions are the freeing of slaves. So essentially, slavery is a massive part of early medieval life. It's a massive part of Cornish economy, from what we can tell for other reasons. And this is essentially saying that the Bishop Comor freed this woman for essentially the communication of his sins. What's really interesting is that at the time Bishop Comor is doing this, the bishop we know of is called Wulfsig, which is an English name. So this and a couple of other entries actually prove that Wulfsig is the same as Comor. So it's actually a native Cornishman. Comor is a Brittonic name who takes an English name for official business, essentially. So when he's doing things in his capacity as the king's representative or anything like that, he uses an Anglo-Saxon name, but he's still a Cornishman, essentially. He still has a Cornish name that he uses. We also have a few bits of text that he may have written when he was a younger man, where it may be that his name was Blethian, his sort of pre-bishop name, if you like, which is Cornish for wolf victory, wolf brave. It gets a little complex with these names. Whereas Wulfsig is the Anglo-Saxon for brave wolf, wolf victory, this kind of thing. So he may have actually just directly translated a name he was already using. So we see more and more of that sort of thing. So there are various charters where Cornish people use English names or vice versa. We see Cornish people using what we would understand to be a Welsh charter format, legal text formats, to give land to English nobles or to, exchange goods with them. There's an increasing level of genuine integration. So they're not just conquered and then that's the end of it. They are actually joining with the English state hand in hand. And the flip side of that is, like with the Romans, they're not eliminated because they're still maintaining their own institutions. They have their own bishop, they have their own church, they have their own nobility in place. They are able to maintain the way that they do things while fitting into the wider English royal infrastructure, which is being developed at this time. Over time, that continues. It then gets a boost actually in 1066, because obviously 1066, we call it the Norman invasion. William the Conqueror actually brings with him Bretons. He brings with him men from Flanders, various other places from all over the sort of that northwest tip of Europe. A lot of the Bretons or a lot of Normans from the Breton marches settle in Cornwall or given lands in Cornwall. So what you have is people who could speak mutually intelligibly well into the 17th century are coming in and settling in the 11th century and are probably able to speak the same language. They can understand each other. They may even be related in some cases of the nobility because they had these split holdings over Brittany and Cornwall. And for that reason, you see much less rebellion in Cornwall than you do other places. Githa, who is Harold Godwinson's mother, attempts to raise a rebellion in Exeter very soon after the events of Hastings, and essentially no one raises their banner to help her. The sort of writers at the time, a guy called Orderic Vitalis, says that William the Conqueror attempts to besiege Exeter. He assaults it because he's William the Conqueror. It's what he does. He doesn't actually break through, but the local men of the city just give up. They open the doors and say, no, it's fine. We're not with her. And she has to flee. So it's not until a Danish fleet arrives in the north of England that anyone from Cornwall seems to join any of these rebellions that are going on over the first years of William's reign. And that may well be, as we've touched on before, with the Vikings and the Scandinavian settlement, that they preferred the idea of a Danish king coming back than they did either an Anglo-Saxon king of the Godwinsons or indeed the Normans, who were starting to get a little bit more restrictive in their rule as it moved towards the feudal system. Moving past that into the medieval period, you can still see that culturally, Cornwall is marked as its own area. This is a map from the 1500s. So you can see we've got Anglia, which is obviously England, Scotia, Wallia, and then Cornwall. So Cornwall is still seen culturally as a separate entity to mainland England. By the end of the 16th century, the English throne essentially decides that if you are in Britain, you're English. And this is where Wales and Scotland and Cornwall all start getting wiped off the maps in favor of just England or Britain or whatever else they could put in. And it's just an unfortunate fact that while Wales and Scotland have been able to reclaim sort of national boundaries, national things in the maps, Cornwall is still sort of looked at as this idea of a county, even though it's actually a duchy, which again originates in this early medieval period and the earldom that the Normans set up when they arrive. So I appreciate that that was a lot of me just spitting words at you, and I apologize for that. But are there any questions while I take a slight gulp of coffee?
So I have a question. The way I understand things, 2000 BC, the Celts were in Central Europe. And I always had the idea that the Germanic tribes came down, and I don't know who came up from the south, so that the Celts were pushed westward. But it looked like from one of your first maps that they sought those areas because there was tin there.
Yeah, and you'll have to forgive me a little bit because this is obviously not necessarily my main area of focus, but there's a lot of concepts and ideas about people and migrations and things which are quite hard to prove, but where you do see the sort of, like I said, that geological map that matches quite closely with those cultural links, I think you can see that regardless of whether a person was genetically a Celt, genetically something else, they had a shared sort of livelihood, they had a shared culture, they had a shared interest in maintaining those maritime links. And you see that as we move into the period of sort of written history. Really interestingly, Julius Caesar, who launched an abortive invasion of Britain, he sort of arrived, had a battle, then left. His justification was that when he was invading Amorica, the tribes there were supported by the tribes from Britain from the southwest with ships and men and arms. So they were actually still linked together, and you can see that even at that point. So it's a kind of consistent through thread that the people involved in these areas were very closely working together and linked, and probably the tin industry was a major driver of that.
Okay, thanks. And I had another question quickly. So I think it's one of those things I've learned and forgot, but I just remembered that. So it's Cornwall. Corn makes sense because horn, and but wall is related to Wales. So why would that name be stuck on that?
Well, so that's because of the Anglo-Saxons. So wall comes from Walas, which is an Old English word. People will tell you it means foreigner, which is a very simplified version of it. It actually could mean anything from sort of not us to Latin speaker. Because, for example, Wallachia in sort of the Czech Republic, I believe, or Eastern Germany, is again the same root word. It's a Germanic word for people who speak Latin or who aren't like us, essentially. So when we have an English name, which is what Cornwall is, that's where that sort of originated. The Cernow, which is obviously the Cornish way of calling themselves, or Cernawion, comes from that earlier Latin, the Cernu, which is the Cerniu, or Corniensis. So yeah, that's kind of where they both come together.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Is Wallonia in Belgium similarly connected in naming?
Yeah, I will. I believe so, and I would be fairly comfortable saying that without knowing for absolute definite.
Can you turn the volume up at all?
Any other questions? Can you still hear me?
Can I pose the question?
Yes, please.
John Webb, can I pose the question? You didn't really touch on the issue of Celtish language, Celtish concept. I've done a similar study to what you put together, and it's very hard the whole research on the Celtish and the Celt is unfolding as we speak. So how do you reflect on the Celtish nature of Cornwall?
So I don't use Celt. So Celt's a very complicated word academically. So we use Celtic fairly freely for Iron Age peoples, but it stems from a Greek encounter with people in essentially Bulgaria and that sort of area who called themselves the Keltoi. But that may well be just a singular tribe of people. However, for the Iron Age, it has widely accepted use, so that's fine. Celtic. So I would normally say Brittonic, which I think I mentioned a few times, because the people living here did refer themselves as Bretones, or seem to have, because that's what the people, the Greeks, the Romans wrote down. It becomes a very loaded word because it's obviously got lots of modern connotations attached to it. Some of those are perfectly accessible, like the Celtic nations, Celtic groups and organizations that use it that way. But particularly when you're talking sort of, I guess, pop history, I suppose. If you say Celts, people, they think woad painted, they think all this sort of stuff. So I tend to stick to Brittonic or Britons because that's essentially closer to what they may have recognized for themselves. Or equally just stick to Demonia or Cornwall, depending on who I'm referring to. As I say, in about the 10th century, so when Athelstan is doing all this uniting and bringing together people, there's a really amazing poem called the Armes Prydain, The Dream of Britain, which is written in Wales. And that, again, refers to everybody essentially because it's about everyone. The general idea is that the Welsh, the Cornish, the Scots, the Picts, the Vikings will all join together and drive the Anglo-Saxons to the sea. And it's the first time this idea of Cymry is used as a kind of people label, essentially. So again, they kind of seem to recognize themselves by these smaller borders rather than sort of an idea of Celticness, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
I guess I have a question too about the Normans. I mean, the name is really an indication of them being Northmen, which is Vikings. At what point did they cease to become Vikings from Scandinavia and turned into French in Normandy?
So they become what we might call French fairly quickly. They are indeed settled there by the Frankish kings to act as guards on the river, essentially. After Paris is burnt a couple of times, but if you look at their artwork, you look at their hairstyles, the way they fight on horseback with heavy horses, that is all very much continental inspired in this kind of Frankish world. So they are much more French than they are Vikings by that point. They still obviously have this appetite for conquest. They conquer England. Others go south, conquer Sicily, join the Crusades, things like that. So I suppose you could argue that they have that inheritance of raiding and conquest. But in terms of language, they speak a French dialect. We wouldn't necessarily call it French because it's previous to that, obviously. They spend quite a lot of time fighting with the Bretons, actually. Even just before the Norman invasion, they are fighting with the Dukes of Brittany to essentially subjugate them. But yeah, no. So it's an interesting question. But yeah, they are much more French, I think, than we tend to give them credit for.
Thank you. Actually, that reminds me of something. When I was at Mont Saint-Michel, there's a cannon that was captured from the English about 100 years after 1066. And it always struck me when I saw that cannon at Mont Saint-Michel, that, all right, 100 years ago, that was us. And now, taking Britain, and now it's the British coming back and attacking Normandy. And it just seemed to me like, they really, in a short time, had developed a separate identity.
It's interesting because essentially the Norman invasion is what draws Britain into European politics. So for much of the Anglo-Saxon period, or the Viking period, it's mostly concerned with what's happening in the British Isles, including Ireland and the Isles in Scotland, things like that. They're obviously influenced, they're trading with all these other areas. Athelstan in particular built what was considered quite a cosmopolitan court around himself. So he had thinkers and scholars from all these other areas coming in. But generally, although he interfered a little bit with Breton politics, you didn't see this kind of same level of invasions and stuff. The Normans, because they essentially have holdings in Normandy, which almost immediately rebel, and then William has to leave England to go and quell the rebellions, they then are fighting France, the kings of France, and that's what sets up hundreds and hundreds of years of European history of essentially the English and the French fighting each other, because they are essentially using English resources to fuel a dynastic war.
Thanks again.
No worries.
Other questions? No other questions, huh? So thank you so much, John, for joining us.
No worries.
I'm looking forward to seeing your book. Like I said, it just kind of fascinates me. The whole idea of Cornishness and how we're hanging in there for so long. Sometimes it's hard to see, but it's definitely there.
I mean, I think that's absolutely the key thing.
How do we get the book? How do we get John's book?
I just went on Amazon and I'm looking for what's the name of your book again, please? I don't have it.
The Western Kingdom, The Birth of Cornwall. And yeah, it's Amazon, and I believe Borders also stock it.
And mine's being shipped from England, but it was very easy to order. Anyone else? So thank you again, John, and we'll look forward to seeing other things that you're going to publish.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.